The first humans to reach the Arctic didn't stumble into a frozen wasteland by accident. They pursued it deliberately, generation after generation, tracking caribou herds across a land bridge that would soon vanish beneath rising seas. Around 15,000 years ago, as massive ice sheets began their slow retreat across North America, small bands of hunter-gatherers moved northward into territories no human had ever seen. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing catastrophe. They were specialists, people who had spent millennia perfecting techniques for survival in the coldest environments on Earth. If you want more stories like this, and don't want to miss the next one, like and subscribe. The archaeological evidence tells a story of remarkable adaptation. Stone tools discovered at sites across the North American Arctic reveal technological sophistication that challenges assumptions about primitive peoples struggling against nature. These early inhabitants crafted specialized implements for specific purposes: delicate microblades for precise cutting, heavy choppers for breaking bone, scrapers designed to prepare animal hides in sub-zero temperatures. Each tool represents accumulated knowledge passed down through countless generations, refined through trial and error in conditions that permitted no mistakes. What drove them north? The conventional answer points to game animals, particularly caribou, whose migrations dictated human movement patterns. But this explanation oversimplifies a more complex relationship with Arctic landscapes. These people weren't merely following food sources. They were actively choosing environments that offered specific advantages: reliable game populations, predictable seasonal patterns, and crucially, isolation from competing human groups to the south. The Arctic provided something increasingly rare as human populations expanded: space. The Paleo-Arctic tradition, as archaeologists term these earliest northern cultures, emerged around 12,000 years ago across Alaska and northwestern Canada. Sites like Trail Creek Caves and Onion Portage contain evidence of sophisticated hunting strategies targeting caribou, bison, and small game. Stone projectile points show remarkable craftsmanship, their fluted bases designed to attach securely to wooden shafts using techniques that required precise knowledge of lithic fracture mechanics. These weren't crude survival tools. They were precision instruments created by master craftspeople who understood materials at a fundamental level. Climate shaped everything. The period between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, known as the hypsothermal, brought warmer temperatures even to Arctic regions. Sea levels rose dramatically as glacial ice melted, flooding coastal areas and creating the island archipelagos that define the modern Arctic landscape. This transformation forced human populations to adapt or relocate. Some groups moved inland, following terrestrial game. Others made a revolutionary choice. They turned toward the sea. The transition to maritime hunting represents one of humanity's most significant technological leaps. Hunting seals, walrus, and whales requires completely different skills than pursuing land animals. Marine mammals are intelligent, dangerous, and inhabit an environment fundamentally hostile to humans. Success demands specialized equipment, intimate knowledge of animal behavior, and cooperation among hunters willing to risk their lives in freezing waters. The groups that mastered these challenges gained access to resources that could sustain much larger populations than terrestrial hunting ever permitted. Around 5,000 years ago, a distinct archaeological culture emerged in Alaska that archaeologists call the Arctic small tool tradition. The name derives from the characteristically tiny stone implements these people created: delicate microblades, miniature scrapers, and projectile points so small they seem almost impractical. Yet these tools enabled precise, efficient work that minimized waste of precious materials. In the Arctic, where stone suitable for toolmaking was scarce in many regions, efficiency meant survival. Arctic small tool people spread rapidly eastward across the North American Arctic, reaching Greenland by approximately 4,500 years ago. This expansion occurred with remarkable speed, suggesting either rapid population growth or the displacement of earlier inhabitants. Archaeological sites from this period reveal a sophisticated material culture, including tailored skin clothing, toggling harpoons for hunting seals through breathing holes in sea ice, and semi-subterranean houses designed to preserve heat in extreme cold. These weren't nomads wandering aimlessly across frozen landscapes. They were colonizers, deliberately settling new territories with proven survival technologies. The relationship between humans and Arctic environments during this period was fundamentally different from southern agricultural societies. Agriculture remained impossible in permafrost regions, with growing seasons measured in weeks rather than months. This meant Arctic peoples never developed the sedentary village life, social hierarchies, or political structures that characterize farming communities. Instead, they maintained flexible social organizations that emphasized individual skill, collective decision-making, and the ability to relocate quickly when circumstances demanded. Kinship structures governed everything. Extended family groups formed the basic social unit, typically comprising 15 to 30 individuals related through blood or marriage. These bands operated with remarkable autonomy, making independent decisions about where to hunt, when to move camp, and how to respond to environmental changes. Leadership emerged through demonstrated competence rather than inherited authority. The best hunter might guide decisions about game pursuit, while an elder with extensive environmental knowledge advised on weather patterns and ice conditions. Authority was situational, temporary, and always subject to group consensus. Seasonal cycles dictated annual routines with rigid precision. Summer meant dispersal into small family groups pursuing caribou inland or fishing at productive river locations. Winter required aggregation into larger communities at coastal sites, where marine mammal hunting provided reliable food sources. These seasonal gatherings served crucial social functions beyond mere survival. They enabled young people to find marriage partners outside their immediate family groups, facilitated trade in specialized materials, and allowed the transmission of knowledge through storytelling and demonstration of technical skills. The technology of survival evolved continuously. By 3,000 years ago, Arctic peoples had developed the toggling harpoon, arguably one of the most ingenious hunting tools ever created. Unlike a simple spear that could pull free from wounded prey, the toggling harpoon featured a detachable head that rotated 90 degrees once embedded in an animal's body. This rotating head, connected to the shaft by a strong line, prevented escape even from powerful marine mammals like walrus or small whales. The mechanical principle was simple, but its execution required sophisticated understanding of materials, angles, and stress forces. Dog domestication transformed Arctic life in ways that paralleled the horse's impact on plains cultures. Dogs provided transportation, hauling supplies across ice and snow on sleds. They served as hunting assistants, tracking game, and alerting hunters to the presence of polar bears or other dangers. During extreme food shortages, dogs represented emergency rations that could mean the difference between starvation and survival. The relationship was utilitarian rather than sentimental, but no less important for that pragmatism. Housing technology reflected deep understanding of thermodynamics and available materials. The stereotypical igloo, while iconic, represented only one housing type among many. More common were semi-subterranean winter houses dug partially into the ground to exploit Earth's insulating properties. Walls constructed from sod, stone, and driftwood, with roofs supported by whale ribs or driftwood beams, created structures that could maintain interior temperatures far above exterior conditions through body heat alone. These houses clustered in small villages at locations offering access to both marine and terrestrial resources, establishing settlement patterns that would persist for thousands of years. Clothing technology achieved levels of sophistication that wouldn't be matched by European Arctic explorers until the early 20th century. Tailored caribou skin garments with fur oriented to maximize insulation created layered systems that trapped air while allowing moisture to escape. Women's expertise in preparing and sewing these garments represented knowledge as crucial as men's hunting skills. A poorly constructed parka could kill its wearer through heat loss or dangerous moisture accumulation. The best seamstresses achieved near-waterproof seams using techniques that involved chewing leather to appropriate softness and stitching with sinew thread that swelled when wet to seal needle holes. Spiritual beliefs during this period remain difficult to reconstruct from archaeological evidence alone, but certain patterns emerge clearly. Animals were not simply resources but entities deserving respect and proper treatment. Rituals surrounded hunting, with specific protocols for approaching game, killing efficiently, and processing carcasses. These weren't arbitrary superstitions. They represented practical knowledge encoded in spiritual frameworks. Respecting animals meant hunting sustainably, processing carcasses completely to avoid waste, and maintaining the ecological relationships that ensured future abundance. Shamanic practices appear in the archaeological record through distinctive artifacts and burial practices, small carved figurines, peculiar bone implements with unknown functions, and burials containing unusual assemblages of objects suggest individuals who occupied special roles within their communities. These specialists likely served as healers, spiritual intermediaries, and keepers of esoteric knowledge. Their authority derived from perceived ability to communicate with non-human entities and manipulate supernatural forces affecting hunting success, weather, and human health. Trade networks extended across vast distances, connecting Arctic communities with peoples thousands of miles away. Native copper from deposits near the Coppermine River reached groups in Alaska and Greenland. Flint from specific quarries in the Canadian Arctic traveled along exchange routes that must have involved multiple intermediary groups. These trade relationships weren't purely economic. They created social bonds between distant communities, facilitated the spread of technological innovations, and provided insurance against local resource failures. Around 1500 years ago, a new cultural tradition emerged in Alaska that would eventually give rise to the ancestors of modern Inuit peoples. The Thule tradition, as archaeologists call it, represented a revolutionary adaptation to Arctic marine environments. Thule peoples developed sophisticated technologies for hunting large whales, including specialized harpoons, floats made from inflated seal skins, and large skin boats capable of carrying multiple hunters. This whaling technology provided access to enormous food resources. A single bowhead whale could sustain a community through an entire winter. The Thule expansion across the Arctic occurred with remarkable rapidity. Within just a few centuries, Thule peoples had spread from Alaska across the Canadian Arctic to Greenland, displacing or absorbing the earlier Dorset culture peoples who had inhabited these regions for millennia. This expansion coincided with the medieval warm period, when somewhat milder Arctic conditions may have facilitated travel and expanded whale populations into previously ice-choked waters. Archaeological evidence suggests the displacement wasn't entirely peaceful, though direct evidence of conflict remains sparse. Thule material culture shows clear continuity with earlier traditions, while adding crucial innovations. Their houses, larger and more substantial than earlier structures, could accommodate extended family groups and included specialized areas for different activities. Storage chambers preserved meat through freezing, enabling communities to accumulate surplus that buffered against periodic hunting failures. The archaeological record reveals communities of unprecedented size and stability, with some villages containing dozens of houses occupied year-round rather than seasonally. The bow and arrow, adopted relatively late in Arctic prehistory, transformed hunting strategies for terrestrial game. This technology allowed hunters to kill caribou from greater distances, reducing the need for elaborate stalking techniques and increasing success rates. Combined with sophisticated ice fishing techniques using lysters and hooks, Arctic peoples by 1,000 years ago had developed a resource extraction toolkit that exploited virtually every available food source in their environment. Social complexity increased alongside technological sophistication. Larger communities required more elaborate mechanisms for conflict resolution and resource distribution. Evidence suggests the emergence of individuals with greater influence, though nothing resembling the hereditary chiefdoms found in more temperate regions. Wealth differences appear in burial goods and house sizes, indicating that some families accumulated more resources than others. Yet the fundamental egalitarianism of Arctic societies persisted. Survival in extreme environments required cooperation that rigid hierarchies would undermine. This was the cultural foundation that would encounter within a few centuries visitors from across the Atlantic, whose presence would transform Arctic life forever. But before that collision of cultures, Thule peoples had created societies perfectly adapted to one of Earth's most challenging environments, with technologies and social organizations that had evolved over thousands of years of continuous habitation. They weren't waiting for history to happen to them. They were living it, creating it, generation by generation, in the endless polar light and dark. The next chapter would bring unprecedented challenges that would test everything their ancestors had built. The Norse arrived in Greenland around 985 CE, not as conquerors, but as desperate refugees fleeing overcrowded farmlands in Iceland. Eric the Red, exiled for manslaughter, had explored Greenland's southwestern coast and returned with tales of green fjords and empty pastures. The name itself was marketing genius, designed to attract settlers to a land that was mostly ice. Several hundred colonists followed him back, establishing two main settlements. The eastern settlement near modern Qaqortoq and the western settlement further north. These weren't towns in any conventional sense, but scattered farms along fjord edges, where maritime climate effects created narrow bands of viable grazing land. The Norse brought with them a complete European agricultural package utterly unsuited to their new environment. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They built churches and eventually a cathedral. They grew barley when conditions permitted, though harvest remained unpredictable. Most crucially, they maintained their identity as European Christians, which meant maintaining trade connections across the Atlantic for essential goods: iron, timber, communion wine, vestments for priests. This dependence on external trade made them fundamentally different from the indigenous peoples who had learned to be self-sufficient. For the first century, the gamble seemed to pay off. Greenland exported walrus ivory and hides to Europe, where they commanded premium prices. The colony grew to perhaps 5,000 people at its peak, spread across hundreds of farms. They built stone churches, established a bishopric, and paid tithes to Rome. Archaeological evidence shows they ate primarily meat and dairy products, with seals providing crucial nutritional supplements during winter months when cattle couldn't be pastured. Then the climate began to shift. The medieval warm period that had enabled Norse expansion started giving way to cooler conditions. Sea ice extended further south for longer periods each year, making voyages to and from Iceland increasingly dangerous. Simultaneously, the market for walrus ivory collapsed as African elephant ivory became more available through Mediterranean trade routes. The economic foundation of the colony crumbled just as environmental conditions deteriorated. The Norse response to crisis reveals everything about why they ultimately failed. Rather than adapting indigenous technologies for marine mammal hunting, they doubled down on livestock farming. Rather than learning to make warm, waterproof clothing from seal and caribou skins, they continued importing wool cloth from Europe. Archaeological analysis of their garbage heaps shows they ate almost no fish despite living beside waters teeming with cod. Cultural identity became a death sentence. They were Christians and farmers, not hunters, and they would die as Christians and farmers. Meanwhile, Thule peoples were expanding eastward into the same regions. The two cultures certainly knew of each other. Norse written sources mention encounters with Skraelings, their term for indigenous peoples. Archaeological sites show Norse artifacts in Thule contexts and vice versa, evidence of trade or raid. But sustained contact never developed into the kind of exchange that might have saved the Norse colony. The cultural gulf proved insurmountable. By 1350, the Western settlement had been abandoned. Accounts from an expedition sent to investigate describe finding only empty farms and cattle gone feral. The Eastern settlement persisted longer, growing increasingly desperate. Skeletal remains from this late period show signs of severe malnutrition. People became shorter with each generation as childhood nutrition declined. Yet they continued building churches, maintaining European dress, and orienting their lives toward a connection with Europe that was becoming ever more tenuous. The last documented contact with the Greenland Norse comes from 1408, when an Icelandic ship attending a wedding was blown off course to Greenland. After that, silence. When European ships finally returned in the early 1700s, they found only ruins. What happened to the final Norse Greenlanders remains uncertain. Some may have died of starvation and disease. Others might have been absorbed into Thule communities, though genetic evidence for this remains limited. Perhaps a few managed passage to Iceland on the last ships before sea ice made the crossing impossible. The mystery endures because no one bothered to record the end of a failed colonial experiment in a land nobody wanted. The contrast with Thule's success couldn't be starker. While Norse communities shrank and vanished, Thule peoples thrived, their population growing and spreading, their flexibility in adapting to changing conditions, their sophisticated understanding of Arctic ecology, and their cultural toolkit designed for the environment rather than imported from elsewhere allowed them to flourish where Europeans failed catastrophically. This pattern of indigenous resilience and European failure would repeat itself across the Arctic for centuries. The next major European intrusion came not from settlers, but from whalers and explorers, beginning in the 1500s. These encounters brought new technologies, new diseases, and new disruptions to societies that had achieved stability over millennia. Basque whalers were probably the first regular European visitors to the eastern Arctic, hunting bowhead whales in the waters between Greenland and Canada. They came seasonally, established temporary shore stations for rendering whale blubber, and departed before winter ice trapped them. Evidence of their presence appears in archaeological sites, fragments of European pottery, iron tools, glass beads. The Basques themselves left little documentation, their voyages being commercial ventures rather than exploration or settlement. The search for the Northwest Passage brought more sustained European presence. English and Dutch explorers, seeking a northern route to Asian markets, probed increasingly far into Arctic waters. Martin Frobisher's expeditions in the 1570s made contact with Inuit peoples, exchanges that combined trade, kidnapping, and violence in roughly equal measure. Frobisher brought Inuit captives back to England, where they were displayed as curiosities before dying of European diseases. The expeditions achieved nothing of commercial value, but they established patterns that would characterize future contact. Henry Hudson's 1610 expedition into the bay that now bears his name ended in mutiny and his death, but it opened the region to intensive European interest. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670, established trading posts around the bay's perimeter and gradually extended operations northward. Unlike the doomed Norse colonists, the company learned to rely on indigenous knowledge and labour. Their business model required maintaining productive relationships with indigenous traders who harvested furs and transported them to coastal posts. This fur trade system transformed indigenous economies without immediately destroying them. Metal tools, particularly iron knives and needles, offered genuine improvements over stone and bone implements. Firearms made hunting more efficient, though their maintenance required continued trade for powder and shot. Glass beads became valued for decorative work. The trade operated through indigenous agency, with hunters and trappers making strategic decisions about when and where to trap, what prices to accept, and how to integrate new goods into existing cultural practices. Yet the transformation was profound and ultimately destructive. Societies that had been self-sufficient became dependent on manufactured goods. The fur trade required hunters to spend time trapping animals for pelts rather than for food, creating vulnerabilities when animal populations fluctuated or when European demand shifted. Competition over trapping territories generated conflicts between groups that had previously maintained stable relationships. The introduction of alcohol, used by traders to facilitate exchanges, caused immediate social damage that compounded over generations. Diseases arrived with every ship. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infections swept through populations that had no immunity. The demographic impact was catastrophic. Communities lost elders who held crucial knowledge about navigation, hunting techniques, and social protocols. The social fabric tore under the strain of watching children die in waves, of losing the teachers who transmitted culture across generations. Some communities were simply erased, their members dying too quickly for others to absorb survivors. The disease impact varied regionally and temporally. Some areas experienced major epidemics early, in the 1600s and 1700s. Others remained relatively isolated until the 1800s. But eventually, every Arctic community felt the impact. Population estimates are necessarily imprecise, but demographic modelling suggests that indigenous Arctic populations may have declined by half or more between 1500 and 1900, with most of that decline occurring after 1700. Religious conversion added another layer of disruption. Moravian missionaries arrived in Greenland and Labrador in the 1700s, establishing mission stations that became centres of European influence. They learned indigenous languages, translated religious texts, and worked to transform not just belief systems, but entire ways of life. Shamanic practices were suppressed as demonic. Traditional songs and stories were replaced with Christian hymns and biblical narratives. The missionaries meant well by their own lights, genuinely believing they were saving souls, but the cultural damage was immense. By the 1800s, commercial whaling had become industrial in scale. American and Scottish whaling fleets penetrated deep into Arctic waters, establishing semi-permanent stations where they overwintered when ice trapped their ships. These whalers employed Inuit hunters, traded European goods, and introduced new disruptions. Some relationships between whalers and indigenous women produced mixed heritage children, creating new social categories and tensions. The whale populations themselves crashed under intensive hunting pressure, eliminating a crucial food source for indigenous communities that had relied on whales for millennia. The collapse of whale stocks by the early 1900s ended commercial whaling, but left indigenous communities facing new crises. Those who had become dependent on trading with whalers found themselves without markets or income. Traditional hunting practices had been disrupted by decades of commercial operations. Communities located near whaling stations faced particular difficulties when the ships stopped coming. Arctic exploration intensified during this period, driven by nationalism and scientific curiosity rather than commercial motives. Expeditions raced to reach the North Pole, map unknown coastlines, and claim territories for European powers. These expeditions relied heavily on indigenous guides and hunters, whose knowledge made survival possible in environments that killed unprepared Europeans with brutal efficiency. Yet the explorers rarely acknowledged this dependence in their published accounts, preferring to portray themselves as conquering heroes rather than guests dependent on local expertise. The Franklin expedition disaster of 1845 demonstrated the lethal consequences of European arrogance. Sir John Franklin's ships, equipped with the latest technology and provisioned for 3 years, vanished into the Arctic with all 129 crew members. Decades of subsequent search expeditions found scattered evidence of catastrophe. Ships crushed in ice, crews dying of starvation and lead poisoning from poorly soldered food tins, possible resort to cannibalism in the final desperate days. Inuit testimony, initially dismissed by European authorities, eventually proved crucial to understanding what had happened. The men had tried to walk to safety, dragging heavy equipment and supplies inappropriate for Arctic travel, refusing to adopt indigenous survival strategies even as they starved. The contrast between Franklin's fate and the survival of John Ray, who learned to travel and hunt like Inuit peoples, illustrates what made the difference between death and survival. Ray wore fur clothing, travelled with dog teams, built snow shelters, and ate whatever food the land provided. His willingness to abandon European cultural norms kept him alive and made his explorations successful. Yet he was criticised in Britain for reporting Inuit accounts of cannibalism among Franklin's crew, as if speaking uncomfortable truths somehow dishonoured the dead. Sovereignty claims began to matter as European powers realised the Arctic possessed strategic and potentially economic value. Canada, Russia, Denmark, Norway, and the United States all asserted control over Arctic territories and waters. These claims ignored indigenous peoples who had occupied these lands for thousands of years. No one asked Inuit or other Arctic peoples whether they consented to being incorporated into nation-states whose capitals were thousands of miles away and whose governments had little understanding of Arctic realities. The transition to colonial administration happened gradually but inexorably. Trading posts became administrative centres. Missionaries established schools where indigenous children were taught in European languages and forbidden to speak their own. Government officials began registering births and deaths, imposing naming systems that replaced indigenous practices with European conventions. The informal relationships that had characterized the fur trade era gave way to formal structures of control backed by state power. Police forces arrived to enforce laws that indigenous peoples had never agreed to follow. The Northwest Mounted Police in Canada, established partly to assert sovereignty over northern territories, built posts in remote communities where their presence symbolized state authority. Officers enforced regulations about hunting seasons, trapping quotas, and land use that contradicted generations of indigenous practice. What had been subsistence activities became crimes requiring permits issued by distant bureaucracies. The legal fiction that these territories had always belonged to European crowns, merely waiting to be properly administered, justified this imposition of control. Government agents distributed metal identification discs to Inuit individuals, assigning numbers to people who already had names. This system, designed for bureaucratic convenience, reduced complex kinship identities to alphanumeric codes. Families were registered, their movements tracked, their economic activities documented. The state wanted to count, categorize, and control populations that had previously moved freely across vast territories according to seasonal cycles and resource availability. What officials called bringing order and civilization, indigenous peoples experienced as suffocating intrusion into every aspect of life. Residential school systems represented the most devastating colonial intervention. Children were forcibly removed from families and communities, transported to distant institutions where they were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their cultures, or maintain connections to traditional knowledge. The explicit goal was cultural destruction, euphemistically termed assimilation. Government officials and church authorities believed they were saving children from savagery, bringing them into civilization through education. The reality involved systematic abuse, cultural genocide, and intergenerational trauma whose effects continue reverberating through indigenous communities today. The schools operated on principles of deliberate cultural annihilation. Children who spoke their languages faced physical punishment. Traditional clothing was confiscated and burned. Hair was cut in violation of cultural practices that gave hair spiritual significance. Students were taught that everything about their heritage was inferior, shameful, and needed to be abandoned. Many children never saw their families for years at a time. Some never returned home at all. dying from disease, malnutrition, or abuse in institutions that prioritized discipline over care. Disease continued killing Indigenous peoples at catastrophic rates throughout the early 20th century. Tuberculosis became endemic in communities where overcrowding, poor nutrition, and lack of medical care created perfect conditions for transmission. Entire families were devastated. Children orphaned by disease were removed to residential schools or foster care with non-Indigenous families. The combined effects of epidemics and forced removal meant many children grew up without knowing their languages, cultures, or family histories. Cultural transmission that had continued for thousands of years was deliberately severed within a single generation. Healthcare systems that developed in the Arctic were designed primarily to serve non-Indigenous populations or to address specific diseases rather than provide comprehensive care. Tuberculosis sanitariums isolated infected individuals for years at a time, separating them from families and communities. Treatment meant forced relocation to distant institutions, where patients were forbidden to leave even when they recovered. Some people were never told they were cured, spending decades in facilities because paperwork was lost or officials forgot about them. Others returned home to find their families had relocated and they couldn't find anyone they knew. Economic transformations accelerated as Arctic regions became increasingly connected to southern markets and administrative centres. Wage labour replaced subsistence activities as fur prices declined, and government regulations made traditional hunting more difficult. Men took jobs in mines, construction projects, and government programs that required them to leave their communities for months at a time. Women found employment in domestic service, cleaning, and cooking for the growing number of non-Indigenous residents who arrived to administer, educate, and police Indigenous populations. The shift from subsistence to wage economy created dependencies that undermined community self-sufficiency. Store-bought food replaced country food, introducing processed products that contributed to diabetes and other health problems previously rare among Indigenous peoples. Clothing, tools, and equipment that had been made locally were now purchased with cash earned through employment controlled by non-Indigenous authorities. The ability to survive independently on the land eroded as younger generations spent their formative years in schools, rather than learning traditional skills from elders. Military installations brought unprecedented numbers of non-Indigenous people into the Arctic during World War II and the subsequent Cold War. The construction of radar stations, airfields, and bases employed Indigenous workers but also disrupted traditional land use patterns, contaminated hunting grounds, and brought alcohol and other social problems to remote communities. The military operated with complete disregard for Indigenous rights or concerns, bulldozing sites, dumping waste, and restricting access to areas that had been used for hunting and fishing for generations. The DEW line, a chain of radar stations built across the Arctic to provide early warning of Soviet attack, exemplified the military's impact. Construction employed thousands of workers, many Indigenous men, who earned wages higher than anything available locally. But the work was temporary, the environmental damage permanent. Abandoned stations left behind contaminated soil, decaying buildings, and toxic waste that would cost billions to remediate decades later. Indigenous communities bore the costs, while others reaped the benefits of military security. Nuclear testing in the Arctic exposed Indigenous peoples to radiation without their knowledge or consent. The Soviet Union conducted tests on Novaya Zemlya. The United States tested weapons in Alaska and conducted experiments involving radioactive materials in northern Canada. Indigenous peoples hunting, fishing, and living in affected areas received radiation doses that would have been considered unacceptable for non-Indigenous populations. No one warned them. No one monitored their health. The long-term consequences for communities exposed to this radiation remain inadequately studied. Resource extraction intensified as improved technology made Arctic minerals, oil, and gas economically viable. Mining operations brought temporary employment, but permanent environmental damage. Tailings ponds leaked toxic waste into waterways. Open-pit mines destroyed landscapes that had sustained caribou herds and other wildlife. Indigenous communities located near these developments faced contaminated water, destroyed hunting grounds, and health problems linked to industrial pollution. The profits flowed south to shareholders, while the costs remained in the north, with people who had never agreed to sacrifice their lands for others' enrichment. Oil development in Alaska proceeded with minimal consideration for Indigenous rights, despite promises that Alaska natives would benefit from resource wealth. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, completed in 1977, crossed lands used for hunting and fishing without adequate consultation or compensation. Spills contaminated rivers and coastal areas. The Exxon Valdez disaster in 1989 devastated Prince William Sound, destroying fisheries and wildlife populations that Indigenous communities depended on. The cleanup employed thousands, but the ecosystem never fully recovered. Political organization among Indigenous peoples grew stronger as they recognized that individual communities couldn't effectively resist the combined power of governments and corporations. Regional and national organizations formed to advocate for rights, negotiate land claims, and challenge policies that threatened Indigenous survival. The Inuit Circumpolar Council, established in 1977, brought together Inuit from Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia to coordinate advocacy on issues affecting all Inuit peoples. Similar organizations formed among other Indigenous groups, creating networks that could share strategies and support each other's struggles. Land claims negotiations acknowledged, however inadequately, that Indigenous peoples had rights to territories they had occupied since time immemorial. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 extinguished Aboriginal title in exchange for cash payments and land grants administered through regional and village corporations. This corporate structure was foreign to Indigenous governance traditions, but was imposed as the price of settling claims. The agreement gave Alaska Natives some control over resources, but also exposed them to market forces and corporate pressures that created new vulnerabilities. Canadian land claim settlements followed different models, but shared the same fundamental problem. They required Indigenous peoples to accept limited rights in exchange for surrendering broader claims. The James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975, negotiated under pressure from massive hydroelectric development, gave Cree and Inuit communities some autonomy and financial compensation, but allowed the flooding of vast territories that had sustained Indigenous peoples for generations. The dams disrupted fish migration, destroyed hunting grounds, and contaminated waterways with mercury that made fish unsafe to eat. Nunavut's creation in 1999 represented the most significant political achievement for Canadian Inuit, establishing a territory with Inuit majority and significant self-government powers. But Nunavut inherited massive challenges: inadequate infrastructure, housing shortages, food insecurity, and social problems rooted in generations of colonial trauma. The territory's government had to operate within the larger Canadian federal system, limiting its ability to address problems in ways that reflected Inuit values and priorities. Still, having Inuit in positions of political authority marked a fundamental shift from the paternalistic administration that had characterized earlier periods. Greenland's path towards self-government proceeded through negotiations with Denmark that gradually transferred more authority to Greenlandic institutions. Home Rule in 1979 gave Greenlanders control over most domestic affairs, while Denmark retained responsibility for foreign policy and defence. The transition to self-government in 2009 expanded Greenlandic authority further, including control over natural resources and their development. These political changes gave Greenlanders greater ability to determine their future but couldn't undo the damage from centuries of colonial rule or immediately resolve the social and economic problems that colonialism had created. Russia's treatment of indigenous peoples in its Arctic territories followed patterns of forced assimilation and cultural suppression that intensified during the Soviet period. Collectivization destroyed traditional economic systems. Nomadic peoples were forcibly settled in permanent villages where they could be more easily controlled and indoctrinated. Children were sent to boarding schools where Russian language and Soviet ideology replaced indigenous cultures. Religious practices were suppressed as superstition. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought economic chaos, but also opportunities for cultural revival as restrictions eased, and indigenous organizations could form more freely. Climate change emerged as an existential threat that compounded all other challenges facing Arctic indigenous peoples. Rising temperatures melted permafrost, destabilizing buildings and infrastructure. Sea ice that had been reliable for hunting and travel became unpredictable and dangerous. Animal populations shifted their ranges and migration patterns, making traditional hunting knowledge less reliable. Coastal erosion forced communities to relocate, abandoning sites occupied for generations. The Arctic environment that had sustained indigenous peoples for thousands of years was transforming with unprecedented speed. Indigenous knowledge about environmental change proved more accurate than scientific predictions in many cases. Elders and hunters observed shifts in animal behavior, ice conditions, and weather patterns years before researchers documented the same changes. But this knowledge was often dismissed by authorities who trusted data over experience. The irony was bitter. After centuries of having their knowledge devalued and suppressed, indigenous peoples watched their warnings about climate change ignored until scientific measurements confirmed what they had been saying all along. Food security became precarious as climate change and pollution made traditional food sources less reliable and sometimes unsafe to eat. Store-bought food remained expensive in remote communities where everything had to be transported by air or sea. A gallon of milk might cost $15 in communities where median incomes were a fraction of southern averages. Processed foods that were affordable contributed to diabetes and other health problems. Programs to support traditional hunting and fishing helped but couldn't fully compensate for the environmental changes making these activities more difficult and dangerous. Mental health crises reflected accumulated trauma from generations of colonial violence. Suicide rates in many Arctic indigenous communities reached levels that would have prompted emergency responses if they had occurred in non-indigenous populations. Substance abuse problems stemmed from despair, trauma, and the breakdown of cultural structures that had previously provided meaning and support. Young people caught between cultures, fluent in neither traditional languages nor dominant languages, neither fully part of indigenous communities nor accepted in settler society, struggled to find identity and purpose. Cultural revitalization efforts worked to preserve and restore languages, traditional practices, and knowledge that had been nearly lost. Language immersion schools taught children in indigenous languages, reversing decades of forced assimilation. Elders worked with younger generations to pass on traditional skills, stories, and values. Artists drew on traditional forms while creating new works that expressed contemporary indigenous experiences. These efforts couldn't undo the damage, but they could ensure that indigenous cultures would survive and adapt rather than disappear as colonizers had intended. The relationship between indigenous peoples and the land remained central despite all the changes. For indigenous peoples, land was never mere property to be bought, sold, or exploited. It was home, identity, and the foundation of cultural and spiritual life. This fundamental difference in worldview created ongoing conflicts with governments and corporations that viewed Arctic lands primarily as resources to be developed. Indigenous efforts to protect the environment weren't just about conservation, but about preserving the physical and cultural survival of peoples whose identities were inseparable from their territories. The struggle for political autonomy gained momentum as indigenous peoples recognized that meaningful self-determination required control over decision-making processes affecting their lives and territories. Colonial governance structures had always positioned Indigenous peoples as subjects rather than citizens, recipients of government services rather than participants in shaping policy. This subordinate status persisted even as formal colonialism ended and Indigenous peoples gained citizenship in the nation-states that claimed their territories. True political power remained concentrated in distant capitals, where politicians and bureaucrats made decisions about Arctic lands and peoples with minimal Indigenous input. Greenland's path towards self-government illustrated both the possibilities and limitations of Indigenous political autonomy within existing state structures. Denmark had governed Greenland as a colony since the 18th century, imposing Danish language, education, and administration on Inuit populations. The introduction of Home Rule in 1979 transferred some governmental functions to Greenlandic authorities, while Denmark retained control over foreign affairs, defence, and monetary policy. This arrangement gave Greenlanders more say in local matters, but kept ultimate authority in Copenhagen. The transition to self-government in 2009 expanded Greenlandic control over natural resources and additional policy areas while maintaining financial dependence on Danish subsidies. Full independence remained a goal for many Greenlanders, but economic realities made immediate separation impractical. The question became not whether Greenland would eventually become independent, but when and under what conditions. Nunavut's creation in 1999 represented a different approach to Indigenous self-determination within a federal state. Inuit organisations had negotiated with the Canadian government for decades to create a new territory where Inuit would form the majority population and exercise significant political influence. The final agreement split the Northwest Territories, creating Nunavut as a public government open to all residents, but with institutions designed to reflect Inuit values and priorities. Inuit Kaujimajatuqangit, traditional Inuit knowledge and ways of doing things, was supposed to guide government operations. The territory's boundaries roughly corresponded to traditional Inuit lands, though they were drawn through negotiation rather than based purely on Indigenous territorial claims. The reality of governing Nunavut proved more complicated than the vision. Inuit did form the majority of the population and held most elected positions, but the government operated primarily in English rather than Inuktitut. Many senior administrative positions went to non-Inuit, because qualified Inuit candidates weren't available due to historical educational disparities. Government structures followed southern Canadian models rather than traditional Inuit decision-making processes. Chronic underfunding left the territorial government unable to provide services comparable to southern Canada, despite much higher costs. Housing shortages, infrastructure deficits, and social problems persisted. Nunavut gave Inuit political representation, but not the resources or full authority needed to address systemic problems. Alaska Native corporations created through the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act represented yet another model for Indigenous self-determination. This one centered on economic development rather than governmental authority. The settlement extinguished Aboriginal land claims in exchange for nearly $1 billion and 44 million acres of land distributed to regional and village corporations owned by Alaska Native shareholders. These corporations operated as for-profit businesses that could develop resources, invest capital, and distribute profits to shareholders. The model aimed to give Alaska Natives economic power and wealth rather than political sovereignty or cultural preservation. The corporate model produced mixed results. Some corporations thrived, making profitable investments and providing substantial benefits to shareholders. Others struggled with mismanagement, bad investments, and internal conflicts. The emphasis on profit sometimes conflicted with cultural values about land stewardship and community welfare. Shareholders could sell their stock to non-natives after a certain period, potentially diluting native control over corporations and land. The settlement resolved land claims, but didn't address ongoing issues of political representation, cultural preservation, or social problems. Alaska Natives gained economic assets, but remained minorities within a state government controlled by non-native majorities. Sámi parliaments in Norway, Sweden, and Finland provided consultative rather than governing authority. These elected bodies represented Sámi interests and advised national governments on policies affecting Sámi peoples, but they lacked legislative or executive power. Governments could and did ignore Sámi parliament recommendations when they conflicted with national priorities. The parliaments helped ensure Sámi voices were heard in policy discussions, but ultimate decision-making remained with national governments responsive primarily to non-Sámi majorities. This consultative model recognized Sámi rights to cultural preservation and participation without granting meaningful political autonomy. Land rights negotiations became central to Indigenous political struggles because control over territory determined who could make decisions about resource development, environmental protection, and community development. Colonial governments had assumed ownership of Arctic lands based on doctrines of discovery and terra nullius that denied Indigenous peoples prior occupation and sovereignty. These legal fictions enabled states to claim vast territories and grant resource extraction rights to corporations without Indigenous consent. Indigenous peoples challenged these claims through courts, negotiations, and political organizing, arguing that their continuous occupation and use of Arctic lands gave them rights that couldn't be extinguished without consent. Comprehensive land claims agreements in Canada aimed to provide certainty about land ownership and resource rights, while compensating Indigenous peoples for lands they surrendered. These modern treaties typically involved Indigenous groups ceding Aboriginal title to vast territories in exchange for ownership of smaller land bases, cash settlements, and guaranteed participation in resource management. The agreements ended the legal uncertainty that made investors nervous about Arctic development while giving Indigenous peoples some control over how development proceeded. Critics argued the treaties forced Indigenous peoples to surrender too much for too little, trading inherent rights for negotiated privileges that governments could modify or eliminate. The implementation of land claims agreements often disappointed Indigenous signatories who found that recognized rights didn't guarantee meaningful control. Resource development decisions still favored corporate and government interests over Indigenous concerns. Environmental assessments required Indigenous consultation, but not consent. Revenue-sharing agreements provided some financial benefits, but not enough to transform community economies or address infrastructure deficits. Co-management boards included Indigenous representatives, but operated within frameworks that prioritized resource extraction over conservation. The agreements brought improvements over previous arrangements where Indigenous peoples had no formal role, but they fell short of the self-determination that negotiations had promised. Resource extraction projects forced Indigenous communities to navigate impossible choices between economic development and environmental protection. Mining, oil, and gas projects promised jobs, revenue, and infrastructure improvements in regions with limited economic alternatives. Companies and governments presented development as the path to prosperity that would lift Indigenous communities out of poverty. But these projects also threatened traditional lands, disrupted wildlife, contaminated water, and accelerated climate change. Communities that opposed projects risked being portrayed as obstacles to progress, standing in the way of benefits for everyone. Communities that accepted projects risked environmental damage and cultural loss that no amount of money could repair. The consultation processes required before major projects proceeded often amounted to empty formalities. Companies and governments had already decided to proceed and viewed consultation as a box to check rather than a genuine opportunity for Indigenous peoples to shape or stop projects. Meetings happened on short notice with technical documents that required expertise to interpret. Indigenous concerns raised during consultations were noted but rarely changed project plans. If communities refused consent, projects proceeded anyway based on determinations that national or regional interests outweighed Indigenous objections. Free, prior, and informed consent, the international standard for Indigenous rights, remained aspirational rather than actual practice in most Arctic jurisdictions. The economic benefits promised from resource projects rarely materialized as advertised. Jobs went primarily to skilled workers brought from outside rather than local residents who lacked required training. Training programs provided didn't lead to permanent employment when projects ended. Revenue-sharing agreements provided less money than projected when commodity prices fell or production declined. Infrastructure improvements served project needs more than community needs. After projects ended, communities were left with environmental damage, boom and bust economic disruption, and social problems that accompanied rapid change. The promised prosperity that justified accepting development rarely arrived, but the costs were paid in full. Environmental degradation from resource extraction accumulated across decades of development with minimal regard for Indigenous rights or environmental protection. Contamination from mining operations poisoned water sources and fish populations. Oil spills damaged coastlines and marine ecosystems. Emissions from industrial facilities contributed to regional pollution and global climate change. The cumulative impacts of multiple projects degraded ecosystems beyond their capacity to support traditional harvesting. Indigenous peoples who depended on healthy environments for food security and cultural practices bore the costs of development while benefits flowed elsewhere. Climate change emerged as the ultimate threat multiplier, exacerbating every challenge Arctic Indigenous peoples faced. Traditional knowledge accumulated over generations became less reliable as environmental conditions changed faster than human adaptation could follow. Sea ice that had supported travel and hunting became too thin and unpredictable to use safely. Permafrost thaw destabilized buildings, roads, and pipelines while releasing greenhouse gases that accelerated warming. Coastal erosion forced communities to relocate, abandoning homes and sacred sites. Species that Indigenous peoples had relied on for food shifted ranges or declined in numbers. The Arctic environment that had sustained human life for thousands of years was transforming into something unfamiliar and dangerous. Indigenous knowledge about climate change offered insights that scientific research initially missed or dismissed. Hunters and elders observed changes in animal behavior, ice conditions, and weather patterns years before researchers documented the same phenomena. Traditional ecological knowledge included detailed observations about species interactions, seasonal cycles, and environmental indicators that complemented scientific data. But this knowledge was often ignored by policymakers, who trusted quantitative data over qualitative observations, computer models over lived experience. The same colonial attitudes that had devalued Indigenous knowledge for centuries continued to marginalize Indigenous expertise about climate change until mounting evidence forced recognition that Indigenous peoples had been right all along. Adaptation to climate change required resources that Indigenous communities lacked. Relocating villages away from eroding coastlines cost hundreds of millions of dollars that neither communities nor governments were willing to spend. Upgrading infrastructure to withstand permafrost thaw and extreme weather required engineering expertise and funding beyond community capacity. Diversifying economies to reduce dependence on climate-vulnerable activities needed investment and training. Without substantial external support, Indigenous communities faced the choice between staying in increasingly dangerous locations or abandoning homes without resources to rebuild elsewhere. International advocacy became crucial as Indigenous peoples recognized that domestic legal and political systems would never provide the self-determination they sought. Indigenous organizations brought concerns to United Nations bodies, international human rights forums, and global environmental conferences. These international platforms gave Indigenous peoples opportunities to publicize rights violations, build alliances with Indigenous peoples from other regions, and pressure governments through international opinion. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007 after decades of Indigenous advocacy, established international standards for Indigenous rights, including self-determination, free prior and informed consent, and cultural preservation. The Declaration's impact remained limited by its non-binding nature and many governments' refusal to fully implement its provisions. States that voted for the Declaration often ignored it when applying principles would conflict with resource development or other national priorities. The gap between international commitments and domestic reality demonstrated that legal recognition of rights meant little without political will and mechanisms for enforcement. Indigenous peoples gained moral authority and international legitimacy through the Declaration, but translating these into concrete improvements required ongoing struggle against governments and corporations that resisted meaningful change. Pan-Arctic Indigenous organizations work to build solidarity and coordinate advocacy across national borders. The Inuit Circumpolar Council, founded in 1977, united Inuit from Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Russia to address common concerns and amplify Inuit voices in international forums. The Sami Council performed similar functions for Sami peoples across Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. These organizations enabled Indigenous peoples to act collectively on issues that transcended national boundaries, particularly climate change and resource development that affected the entire Arctic region. They also provided forums for sharing strategies, coordinating responses, and maintaining cultural connections that colonial borders had disrupted. The permanent participant status that Indigenous organizations gained in the Arctic Council gave them formal roles in the primary intergovernmental forum addressing Arctic issues. This recognition of Indigenous peoples as legitimate stakeholders in Arctic governance represented progress from earlier eras when states made decisions about the Arctic without any Indigenous input, but permanent participants couldn't vote on Arctic Council decisions. And the forum focused primarily on environmental and scientific cooperation rather than Indigenous rights or self-determination. The inclusion of Indigenous organizations provided visibility and influence, but not equality with the 8 Arctic states that controlled the Council. Youth movements within Indigenous communities brought new energy to struggles for rights and self-determination, while sometimes challenging traditional leadership and approaches. Young Indigenous activists used social media to organize, document rights violations, and build international support networks. They connected Indigenous struggles to broader movements for social justice, environmental protection, and decolonization. Some criticized what they saw as older generations' excessive willingness to compromise with governments and corporations. Tensions between youth activists and traditional leaders reflected both generational differences and the difficult reality that Indigenous communities had to navigate between confrontation and negotiation, between maintaining cultural traditions and adapting to changed circumstances. The cultural revitalization movements that emerged across Arctic Indigenous communities represented perhaps the most profound response to centuries of suppression and forced assimilation. Language reclamation became central to these efforts, as elders who still spoke Indigenous languages worked urgently to teach younger generations before that knowledge disappeared forever. Immersion schools, where children learn through Indigenous languages rather than merely studying them as subjects, showed particular promise. Research demonstrated that children educated through Indigenous languages developed stronger cultural identities while performing as well, or better academically, than those in mainstream schools. The urgency intensified as linguistic studies revealed the accelerating pace of a language loss, with most Arctic Indigenous languages classified as endangered or critically endangered. Traditional knowledge transmission faced the challenge of adapting practices developed over millennia to contemporary conditions where young people spent their days in classrooms rather than on the land. Some communities created land-based education programs that took students out of conventional school settings for extended periods to learn hunting, fishing, and survival skills from elders. These programs reconnected youth with territories their ancestors had inhabited while teaching practical skills and cultural values that formal education systems had devalued or ignored. Participants consistently reported that land-based learning strengthened their sense of identity and belonging in ways that conventional education never achieved. The revival of traditional arts and crafts served both cultural and economic purposes, as artists drew on ancestral techniques and designs to create contemporary works that found markets among collectors and tourists. Carving, textile work, and jewelry making provided income while maintaining connections to cultural traditions. Some artists pushed boundaries by incorporating traditional elements into modern artistic forms, creating hybrid expressions that honored the past, while engaging with contemporary realities. These artistic innovations sparked debates within communities about authenticity and the boundaries of tradition, reflecting broader questions about how cultures should evolve while maintaining distinctive identities. Ceremonial practices that colonial authorities had banned or discouraged experienced renewed interest as communities reclaimed spiritual traditions that connected them to ancestors and territories. Drum dances, naming ceremonies, and seasonal celebrations brought communities together while transmitting cultural knowledge and values to younger generations. The public performance of these ceremonies asserted Indigenous presence and cultural vitality in the face of continued marginalization. Some communities struggled with questions about which practices to revive and how to conduct ceremonies when knowledge had been interrupted by generations of suppression. The reconstruction of traditional practices required creativity and flexibility rather than simple restoration of the past. The relationship between cultural revitalization and political self-determination became increasingly apparent as Indigenous peoples recognized that meaningful autonomy required not just political institutions, but also cultural foundations that could sustain distinctive identities. Communities that successfully revitalized languages and cultural practices showed greater cohesion and capacity to resist pressures for assimilation. Cultural strength translated into political strength as communities with vibrant cultural identities proved more effective at defending rights and pursuing self-determination. This connection between culture and politics meant that attacks on Indigenous cultures through education, child welfare, or resource development policies had political as well as cultural dimensions. The incorporation of traditional knowledge into resource management and environmental policy represented another arena where Indigenous peoples challenged colonial frameworks that had dismissed their expertise as primitive superstition. Scientific research increasingly validated what Indigenous peoples had always known about animal behavior, plant ecology, and environmental change. Co-management agreements that gave Indigenous peoples formal roles in wildlife and resource decisions provided opportunities to apply traditional knowledge alongside Western scientific approaches. These arrangements worked best when they genuinely respected Indigenous knowledge, rather than simply incorporating it as supplementary information within unchanged management frameworks. Climate change documentation by Indigenous observers provided crucial data about environmental transformations that scientific monitoring systems had missed or failed to understand. Indigenous hunters and herders noticed changes in animal migration patterns, sea ice conditions, and weather predictability years before scientists recognized these shifts. The detailed ecological knowledge that Indigenous peoples maintained through daily subsistence activities enabled them to detect subtle changes that periodic scientific surveys overlooked. Research collaborations that combined Indigenous observations with scientific measurements produced more comprehensive understanding of climate impacts than either knowledge system could achieve alone. The contamination of traditional foods through industrial pollution and long-range transport of toxins created impossible dilemmas for Indigenous peoples who depended on country food for nutrition and cultural identity. Mercury in fish, persistent organic pollutants in marine mammals, and radioactive fallout in reindeer and caribou meant that the foods that had sustained Indigenous peoples for millennia now posed health risks. Public health authorities sometimes advised reducing consumption of traditional foods, creating conflicts between nutritional recommendations and cultural practices. Communities struggled to balance health concerns against the cultural, social, and nutritional importance of country food harvesting and sharing. The economic development promoted by governments and corporations as solutions to Indigenous poverty often threatened the subsistence activities that provided food security and cultural continuity. Mining operations disrupted caribou migration routes. Oil and gas development contaminated waters that sustained fish populations. Industrial forestry destroyed hunting territories. Indigenous peoples found themselves forced to choose between wage employment that required abandoning subsistence activities and poverty that resulted from protecting traditional ways of life. This false choice ignored possibilities for economic development that supported rather than replaced subsistence economies. Tourism presented both opportunities and risks as Indigenous communities considered whether to commercialize cultural practices and traditional knowledge. Some communities developed tourism operations that provided income while educating visitors about Indigenous cultures and contemporary realities. Others worried that tourism would commodify sacred practices, create artificial performances for external audiences, and reinforce stereotypes about Indigenous peoples as relics of the past. The most successful tourism initiatives involved Indigenous control over how cultures were presented and clear boundaries around what would and would not be shared with outsiders. The digital revolution created unprecedented opportunities for Indigenous peoples to document and share knowledge, connect dispersed community members, and organize political action. Social media enabled rapid mobilization around threats to rights or territories. Digital archives preserved elder knowledge in accessible formats. Online language learning resources made Indigenous languages available to learners anywhere. Video documentation captured traditional practices and oral histories before knowledge holders passed away. These technological tools served Indigenous purposes, despite originating from the same Western societies that had colonized Indigenous peoples. The tensions between individual rights frameworks that dominated Western legal systems and collective rights that characterized Indigenous societies created ongoing challenges for translating Indigenous political aspirations into legal structures that states would recognize. Western legal systems struggled to accommodate collective land ownership, communal decision-making, and intergenerational responsibilities that didn't fit individualistic property and rights frameworks. Indigenous peoples insisted that self-determination required recognition of collective rights rather than merely protecting individual Indigenous peoples' rights within dominant legal systems. This fundamental difference in how rights were conceptualized created barriers to mutual understanding and legal recognition. Gender relations within Indigenous communities became contested terrain as communities navigated between traditional roles and contemporary equality norms. Some Indigenous women argued that traditional societies had been egalitarian before colonization disrupted balanced gender relations. Others pointed to patriarchal practices within Indigenous communities that couldn't be blamed entirely on colonial influence. Discussions about gender roles, leadership, and family structures revealed diversity within Indigenous communities and the dangers of essentializing Indigenous cultures as uniformly traditional or uniformly egalitarian. These internal debates demonstrated that Indigenous communities, like all societies, continuously negotiated cultural values and social practices, rather than simply preserving unchanged traditions. The child welfare systems that had removed Indigenous children for generations underwent reforms in many jurisdictions, giving Indigenous authorities greater control over decisions affecting Indigenous children. These changes recognized the cultural genocide that child removal policies had perpetrated and acknowledged Indigenous peoples' rights to maintain family and community integrity. Implementation remained inconsistent as child welfare workers struggled to balance safety concerns against preferences for keeping children within Indigenous communities. High rates of Indigenous children in care persisted in many regions, reflecting ongoing socio-economic challenges and sometimes continued bias within child welfare systems. Education reform efforts sought to create systems that prepared Indigenous youth for contemporary economies while maintaining cultural identities and connections to communities. Indigenous-controlled schools demonstrated that education could strengthen, rather than undermine, cultural identities when curriculum reflected Indigenous knowledge and values. The shortage of Indigenous teachers, inadequate funding, and pressure to meet standardized testing requirements complicated these efforts. Schools served multiple functions within Indigenous communities, operating as cultural centers and community hubs, as well as educational institutions. This expanded role meant that education reform had implications far beyond academic achievement. The justice systems that incarcerated Indigenous peoples at dramatically disproportionate rates slowly began incorporating Indigenous approaches to justice and healing. Sentencing circles, community-based sanctions, and healing lodges provided alternatives to incarceration that addressed root causes of criminal behavior while maintaining community ties. These programs showed promise for reducing recidivism and supporting rehabilitation, but they received inadequate resources and remained marginal within justice systems still dominated by punitive approaches. The overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in prisons continued to reflect the poverty, trauma, and social disruption that colonialism had created. The environmental movement's growing recognition of Indigenous peoples as essential allies in protecting ecosystems created new opportunities for Indigenous peoples to gain support for land rights and self-determination. Conservation organizations that had previously supported protected areas that excluded Indigenous peoples increasingly acknowledged that Indigenous stewardship had maintained biodiversity and that Indigenous rights and environmental protection were compatible. This shift enabled some Indigenous peoples to leverage environmental concerns to advance political goals, though it also created pressure to perform as ideal ecological stewards, rather than as peoples with diverse interests and aspirations. The extractive industries that dominated Arctic economies faced increasing opposition from Indigenous peoples who had experienced broken promises, environmental destruction, and minimal benefits from resource development on their territories. Mining companies discovered that projects could be delayed or blocked by Indigenous opposition, expressed through legal challenges, political pressure, and direct action. This growing Indigenous power forced some corporations to negotiate agreements that provided employment, revenue sharing, and environmental protections. Other companies responded by attempting to divide communities through selective benefits, or by lobbying governments to weaken Indigenous rights. The struggle over resource development continued to define relationships between us peoples, states, and corporations. The climate negotiations that would determine humanity's response to global warming increasingly featured Indigenous voices demanding that solutions respect Indigenous rights and incorporate Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous peoples argued that they bore disproportionate climate impacts, despite minimal responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions that caused warming. They insisted that climate responses should support Indigenous self-determination, rather than imposing new forms of external control over Indigenous territories. The Paris Agreement's acknowledgement of Indigenous rights in its preamble represented progress, but translating this recognition into climate policies that genuinely respected Indigenous peoples required continued advocacy and pressure. The uncertainty that characterized Indigenous futures reflected both the threats that colonialism and climate change posed, and the resilience that Indigenous peoples had demonstrated through centuries of survival and resistance. Communities faced difficult decisions about whether to relocate from threatened coastal areas or to defend ancestral territories against rising seas. They navigated between wage employment and subsistence activities, between cultural preservation and adaptation, between confrontation and negotiation with states and corporations. These choices occurred within contexts that colonialism had created and that continued to constrain options available to Indigenous peoples. Yet Indigenous peoples consistently demonstrated creativity and determination in pursuing self-determination despite obstacles that would have destroyed less resilient peoples. The digital technologies that transformed communication patterns worldwide during the early 21st century created unprecedented opportunities for Indigenous peoples to connect across vast distances, while simultaneously presenting challenges related to cultural preservation and generational divides. Social media platforms enabled Indigenous activists to coordinate campaigns, share traditional knowledge, and build solidarity networks that transcended the geographical isolation that had previously limited collective action. Young Indigenous people used these tools to assert contemporary Indigenous identities that incorporated traditional values within modern contexts, challenging stereotypes that portrayed Indigenous cultures as frozen in the past or inevitably disappearing. These digital networks proved particularly valuable for language revitalization efforts that connected elders with young learners across communities, separated by forced relocations and administrative boundaries. Video conferencing allowed language teachers to provide instruction to students in remote locations where no local speakers remained. Digital archives preserved recordings of elders speaking languages that faced imminent extinction, creating resources that future generations could access even after the last fluent speakers had passed. Mobile applications taught Indigenous languages through interactive games and lessons that appealed to young people who might otherwise show little interest in language learning. The creation of Indigenous-controlled digital content challenged the historical pattern where outsiders had documented and interpreted Indigenous cultures for external audiences. Indigenous filmmakers, podcasters, and social media creators produced content that presented Indigenous perspectives directly rather than through the filter of non-Indigenous intermediaries. These creators addressed diverse audiences simultaneously, speaking to community members about internal issues while educating external audiences about Indigenous realities and countering persistent stereotypes. The ability to control representation marked a significant shift from earlier periods when Indigenous peoples had minimal influence over how they appeared in media and popular culture. The algorithms that determine what content reached audiences on major platforms created new forms of marginalization that replicated patterns from earlier media systems. Indigenous content creators discovered that posts in Indigenous languages received dramatically reduced visibility compared to English content, effectively penalizing efforts to use and promote endangered languages. Content addressing political issues faced restrictions or removal under policies that platforms enforced inconsistently, often treating Indigenous advocacy as more problematic than comparable content from dominant groups. These digital barriers required Indigenous creators to develop strategies for navigating platform rules while maintaining authentic voices and messages. The data sovereignty movement that emerged from Indigenous concerns about research ethics expanded to address how digital technologies collected, stored, and used information about Indigenous peoples and territories. Indigenous leaders argued that data about their communities constituted a form of collective property that should be controlled by communities themselves rather than by governments, corporations, or researchers who had historically exploited Indigenous knowledge without consent or benefit sharing. This principle challenged standard practices in fields ranging from genetic research to social media analytics, requiring new protocols that respected Indigenous rights to control information. The artificial intelligence systems that increasingly shaped access to information and services raised concerns about whether algorithms trained primarily on data from dominant populations would serve Indigenous peoples effectively or perpetuate existing biases and inequities. Facial recognition systems that performed poorly on darker-skinned faces demonstrated how technologies could embed racial biases, while translation tools that focused on major languages left Indigenous languages unsupported. Indigenous technology experts worked to ensure that Indigenous perspectives influenced the development of emerging technologies rather than being ignored until after systems had been deployed in ways that harmed Indigenous communities. The education systems that prepared young people for futures in rapidly changing economies struggled to balance multiple, sometimes conflicting goals, including cultural preservation, academic achievement, and economic opportunity. Indigenous educators worked to develop curricula that taught traditional knowledge and languages, while also providing skills needed for employment in contemporary economies. This balancing act required careful navigation between elders who emphasized cultural continuity and parents who wanted their children to access economic opportunities that required fluency in dominant languages and mainstream educational credentials. The residential school legacy continued to shape education debates. As communities grappled with whether school systems could ever serve Indigenous interests, or whether they remained fundamentally colonial institutions that assimilated Indigenous children into dominant cultures. Some communities established independent schools controlled entirely by Indigenous authorities, creating environments where Indigenous languages served as primary languages of instruction and where curricula centered Indigenous knowledge and values. These schools demonstrated possibilities for education that supported rather than undermined Indigenous cultural survival, but they faced chronic underfunding and struggled to provide the full range of programs available in mainstream schools. The mental health crisis that affected Indigenous communities with devastating intensity reflected accumulated trauma from generations of colonial violence, ongoing experiences of racism and discrimination, and the stress of navigating between cultures while often feeling fully accepted in neither. Suicide rates in some Indigenous communities reached levels that would have triggered emergency responses if they had occurred in non-Indigenous populations, yet adequate mental health services remained unavailable in most remote areas. Traditional healing practices offered important resources for addressing trauma and promoting wellness, but they could not alone resolve problems rooted in poverty, inadequate housing, and the ongoing impacts of colonialism. The healthcare systems that served Indigenous peoples in Arctic regions face particular challenges related to geographical isolation, limited infrastructure, and the difficulty of recruiting healthcare professionals willing to work in remote communities. Medical evacuation to distant urban centres for specialised care separated patients from family support systems and cultural contexts that promoted healing. The cultural gaps between healthcare providers trained in southern urban centres and Indigenous patients who understood health and illness through different conceptual frameworks sometimes resulted in miscommunication and inadequate care that reflected broader patterns of systemic discrimination. The traditional healing practices that Indigenous peoples maintained despite centuries of suppression by missionaries and government authorities experienced renewed recognition as valuable healthcare resources that address dimensions of wellness that biomedicine often neglected. Healers who worked with medicinal plants, ceremonies, and spiritual practices provided care that many Indigenous people found more culturally appropriate and effective than Western medical approaches, particularly for mental health and chronic conditions. The integration of traditional and biomedical approaches in some healthcare facilities demonstrated possibilities for systems that respected Indigenous knowledge while providing access to beneficial technologies and treatments developed through Western scientific research. The food security challenges that affected many Indigenous communities reflected the disruption of traditional harvesting systems, contamination of country foods through industrial pollution, and the high cost of imported foods in remote areas where transportation expenses made fresh produce prohibitively expensive. The nutrition transition from traditional diets rich in protein and omega-3 fatty acids to processed foods high in sugar and refined carbohydrates contributed to epidemic rates of diabetes and obesity. Programs that supported traditional harvesting and food sharing addressed both nutritional and cultural needs while reducing dependence on expensive imported foods, but they could not fully resolve problems created by environmental change and economic marginalization. The cultural revitalization movements that flourished in many Indigenous communities during the early 21st century demonstrated determination to maintain distinct identities. Despite pressures toward assimilation and the challenges of cultural transmission, in contexts where daily life operated primarily in dominant languages and according to mainstream cultural norms. Communities invested resources in culture camps where young people learned traditional skills, in feast halls where ceremonies maintained social bonds, and in programs where elders taught languages and cultural knowledge. These efforts required sustained commitment and creativity to make cultural practices relevant and appealing to young people, whose life experiences differed dramatically from those of elders who had grown up on the land. The intergenerational relationships that sustained cultural transmission faced strain from the rapid social changes that created vastly different life experiences for elders and youth. Young people who grew up with internet access, smartphones, and global popular culture sometimes struggled to relate to elders whose formative experiences occurred on the land in contexts where traditional knowledge provided essential survival skills. Elders sometimes viewed youth culture with alarm, seeing it as evidence of cultural loss and failed transmission of values. Building bridges across these divides required mutual respect and willingness to recognize that Indigenous cultures had always adapted to changing circumstances, and that contemporary youth who engaged with global culture while maintaining Indigenous identities continued processes of creative adaptation that had always characterized Indigenous peoples. The land-based programs that took young people out on the land to learn traditional skills proved particularly effective at transmitting cultural knowledge and building connections between generations. Away from the distractions of village life and immersed in environments where traditional knowledge demonstrated immediate practical value, young people often showed deep interest in learning skills and stories that seemed irrelevant in village contexts. These programs also provided opportunities for elders to demonstrate expertise and authority in domains where their knowledge surpassed that of younger generations, accustomed to being more technologically competent than their elders. The artistic expressions that Indigenous peoples created challenged stereotypes and demonstrated the vitality and contemporary relevance of Indigenous cultures. Indigenous artists working in diverse media, from traditional sculpture and textiles to contemporary installation art and digital media, produced work that addressed political issues, explored cultural identity, and asserted Indigenous presence in the contemporary world. Literature by Indigenous authors reached growing audiences, providing perspectives on historical and contemporary experiences that countered dominant narratives and educated non-Indigenous readers about realities that mainstream education systems had ignored or distorted. The music that Indigenous artists created blended traditional and contemporary elements, using ancestral languages and traditional instruments alongside electronic production and global musical styles. This creative synthesis demonstrated how Indigenous cultures remain dynamic and innovative, rather than existing as museum pieces to be preserved unchanged. The success of Indigenous artists in reaching mainstream audiences challenged assumptions that Indigenous cultural expressions held value only for Indigenous peoples themselves, or for anthropologists documenting vanishing traditions. The sports that provided recreation and entertainment in Indigenous communities also served as sites for cultural expression and collective identity. Indigenous athletes who achieved success in mainstream sports competitions became sources of community pride, while also facing pressure to serve as representatives of their peoples. The establishment of Indigenous sporting competitions created opportunities for communities to gather, strengthen social ties, and celebrate shared identities. Traditional games that had been suppressed or abandoned experienced revival as communities recognized their value for promoting physical fitness, teaching cultural values, and maintaining connections to ancestors who had played the same games. The spiritual practices that sustained Indigenous peoples through centuries of colonial oppression continued to provide meaning and guidance in contemporary contexts. Ceremonies that maintained relationships with the land and with spiritual beings offered participants experiences of connection and belonging that countered the alienation and disconnection that characterized much of modern life. The protection of sacred sites from development became a focal point for struggles over land rights and cultural survival, with communities asserting that certain places held spiritual significance that should outweigh economic considerations. The religious diversity within Indigenous communities reflected both colonial missionary efforts and the creativity with which Indigenous peoples had engaged with Christianity and other introduced religions. Some Indigenous people practice Christianity while maintaining traditional spiritual beliefs and practices, creating syncretic forms that combined elements from different traditions. Others rejected Christianity as a colonial imposition and worked to revitalize pre-contact spiritual practices. Still others identified as secular or explored spiritual traditions from other Indigenous peoples or from non-Indigenous sources. This diversity sometimes created tensions within communities, but it also demonstrated the agency with which Indigenous peoples navigated religious and spiritual dimensions of contemporary life. The future that awaited Indigenous peoples remained uncertain, shaped by forces largely beyond their control, including climate change, global economic systems, and the policies of nation-states that continued to claim authority over Indigenous territories. Yet Indigenous peoples approached these challenges with determination forged through centuries of survival against threats that had destroyed less resilient peoples. They built on foundations created by previous generations who had maintained languages, cultural practices, and connections to land through periods when assimilation appeared inevitable. They developed strategies that combined traditional knowledge with contemporary tools, local action with global advocacy, cultural preservation with creative adaptation. The resilience that Indigenous peoples demonstrated did not mean that all challenges could be overcome or that outcomes would necessarily be positive. Climate change might render some territories uninhabitable, regardless of Indigenous efforts to adapt. Economic marginalization might continue to limit opportunities available to Indigenous young people. Governments might continue to prioritize resource extraction over Indigenous rights. Yet Indigenous peoples had repeatedly defied predictions of their disappearance, maintaining distinct identities and pursuing self-determination despite obstacles that would have crushed peoples with less determination. This history of survival and resistance provided reason for hope, even as it acknowledged the gravity of challenges ahead. The global movements that emerged during the late 20th and early 21st centuries created unprecedented opportunities for Indigenous peoples to connect across national boundaries and coordinate advocacy strategies that addressed shared challenges. International forums, including the United Nations, provided platforms where Indigenous representatives could articulate demands for recognition and rights to audiences that included government officials, human rights organizations, and media outlets capable of amplifying Indigenous voices. The adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007 represented a milestone achievement that codified principles of self-determination, land rights, and cultural preservation in international law, though its non-binding status limited its practical enforcement power. The Declaration's articles affirmed Indigenous rights to maintain distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while participating fully in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of states. It recognized Indigenous rights to lands, territories, and resources traditionally owned, occupied, or used, establishing principles for obtaining free, prior, and informed consent before undertaking projects affecting Indigenous territories. The document acknowledged Indigenous rights to maintain, control, protect, and develop cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. Despite these comprehensive protections, implementation remained inconsistent as states retained primary authority over interpretation and enforcement within their territories. Indigenous organizations that operated at international levels developed sophisticated advocacy strategies combining legal expertise, media savvy, and political networking. Groups like the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, Cultural Survival, and Survival International documented human rights violations, provided technical assistance to local communities, and pressured governments and corporations to respect Indigenous rights. These organizations facilitated connections between Indigenous peoples in different regions who face similar challenges, enabling exchange of strategies and expressions of solidarity that strengthened global Indigenous movements. The environmental movement's growing influence created strategic opportunities for Indigenous peoples to position themselves as guardians of ecosystems threatened by industrial development. Scientific research increasingly demonstrated that Indigenous-managed territories maintained higher biodiversity and better forest cover than comparable areas under other management regimes. This evidence supported Indigenous claims that traditional knowledge systems incorporated sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and sustainable resource management. Environmental organizations formed alliances with Indigenous communities to oppose destructive projects, though these partnerships sometimes reflected divergent priorities, with environmentalists focused on conservation and Indigenous PC, OPLES emphasizing rights and self-determination. Climate change emerged as both threat and opportunity for Indigenous advocacy as rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and extreme weather events disproportionately affected Indigenous communities in vulnerable ecosystems. Arctic peoples witnessed melting ice that disrupted traditional hunting practices and threatened coastal settlements. Pacific Islanders faced rising seas that endangered their homelands. Indigenous peoples in drought-prone regions experienced water scarcity that undermined agricultural systems. These impacts provided compelling evidence for international climate negotiations, where Indigenous representatives argued that their communities bore disproportionate costs of emissions produced primarily by industrialized nations. The recognition that Indigenous knowledge systems contained valuable information about climate adaptation strengthened arguments for including Indigenous peoples in environmental decision-making. Traditional ecological knowledge accumulated over generations provided detailed observations about environmental changes and time-tested strategies for adapting to variable conditions. Scientists increasingly collaborated with Indigenous knowledge holders to understand ecological processes and develop climate adaptation strategies, though power imbalances and intellectual property concerns complicated these partnerships. Digital technologies transformed possibilities for Indigenous cultural production, political organizing, and economic development in ways that previous generations could not have imagined. Social media platforms enabled Indigenous peoples to share stories, coordinate activism, and build networks that transcended geographical boundaries. Online communities created spaces where Indigenous peoples could connect with others who shared similar experiences and challenges, reducing isolation that had previously limited possibilities for collective action. Digital archives preserved cultural materials, including recordings of elders speaking traditional languages, documentation of ceremonies and traditional practices, and historical photographs that future generations could access. The democratization of media production through affordable digital recording equipment and internet distribution channels enabled Indigenous peoples to create and share films, music, and other cultural productions without relying on mainstream media gatekeepers who had historically ignored or misrepresented Indigenous stories. Indigenous filmmakers produced documentaries that educated broader audiences about historical injustices and contemporary challenges, while also creating entertainment content that reflected Indigenous perspectives and experiences. Musicians blended traditional sounds with contemporary genres to create innovative forms that appealed to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous audiences. Economic development strategies that Indigenous communities pursued reflected diverse approaches to balancing material prosperity with cultural preservation and environmental sustainability. Some communities embraced resource extraction projects that generated substantial revenues but raised concerns about environmental damage and cultural disruption. Others developed tourism enterprises that provided income while sharing cultural traditions with visitors, though commodification of culture for tourist consumption created tensions about authenticity and appropriateness. Still others focused on revitalizing traditional economic activities, including fishing, hunting, agriculture, and craft production that maintain connections to ancestral practices while providing livelihoods. The gaming industry, that emerged in some jurisdictions following legal changes that permitted Indigenous-operated casinos, generated enormous revenues that transformed economic conditions in certain communities. Successful gaming operations funded infrastructure improvements, educational programs, healthcare services, and cultural preservation initiatives that enhanced quality of life for community members. They created employment opportunities in regions that had previously offered limited economic prospects. However, gaming revenues distributed unevenly across Indigenous communities, with some nations earning substantial income, while others lacked resources or legal authority to establish gaming operations. The social impacts of gaming, including problem gambling and associated community disruptions, also generated controversy about whether benefits outweighed costs. The legal battles that Indigenous peoples fought in courts throughout the world yielded mixed results that reflected judicial systems' varying willingness to recognize Indigenous rights against competing claims from states and private interests. Landmark cases established important precedents affirming land rights, treaty obligations, and governmental duties to consult with Indigenous peoples before undertaking projects affecting their territories. The Mabo decision in Australia that recognised native title rights, the Delgamuka W case in Canada that affirmed Aboriginal title, and the Awas Tingni decision in Nicaragua that required recognition of Indigenous land rights represented significant victories that strengthened legal foundations for Indigenous claims. However, judicial remedies proved limited, as courts typically deferred to legislative and executive branches on policy matters, while applying legal doctrines that favoured state sovereignty over Indigenous rights. Even favourable court decisions required political will for implementation and enforcement that governments sometimes lacked or refused to provide. The expense and duration of legal proceedings also limited accessibility for many Indigenous communities that lacked resources for sustained litigation. These limitations prompted some Indigenous peoples to pursue direct action and civil disobedience when legal channels failed to protect rights or prevent harmful projects. The younger generations who would inherit responsibility for Indigenous communities' futures faced choices about how to maintain cultural identities while participating in increasingly interconnected global systems. Young people who left communities to pursue educational and employment opportunities in urban centres sometimes struggled to maintain connections with cultural traditions and homelands. Those who remained in communities confronted limited economic prospects but maintained closer ties to elders, language, and land, creating pathways that enabled young people to achieve material success while remaining connected to Indigenous identities and communities, required innovative approaches to education, economic development, and cultural transmission. Educational institutions that Indigenous peoples controlled provided opportunities to deliver instruction that centered Indigenous knowledge, languages, and perspectives rather than treating them as supplements to dominant curricula. Tribal colleges in the United States, Indigenous-controlled schools in various countries, and university programs dedicated to Indigenous studies created spaces where Indigenous students could pursue higher education while maintaining cultural connections. These institutions produced graduates equipped with skills necessary for professional success and deep understanding of cultural traditions and community needs. They conducted research that addressed questions relevant to Indigenous communities and produced scholarship that challenged colonial narratives, ABU, Ute Indigenous peoples and histories. The revitalization of Indigenous languages represented perhaps the most critical challenge for cultural survival, as languages carried not merely vocabulary, but entire systems of knowledge, values, and relationships that could not be fully translated into colonial languages. Communities where elders still spoke traditional languages as first languages faced urgent needs to transmit linguistic knowledge to younger generations before remaining fluent speakers passed away. Immersion programs that surrounded children with Indigenous languages throughout school days showed promise for creating new generations of fluent speakers, though required substantial resources and long-term commitment. Technology offered new tools for language learning, including apps, online courses, and digital archives. F recordings, though, could not replace face-to-face interaction with fluent speakers that provided the rich, contextual learning necessary for true fluency. The healing that Indigenous communities needed to recover from historical trauma and ongoing marginalization required addressing both individual and collective dimensions of pain and loss. Therapeutic approaches that incorporated Indigenous cultural practices and worldviews showed greater effectiveness than mainstream interventions that ignored cultural contexts. Community-based healing initiatives that brought people together to share experiences, perform ceremonies, and support one another created spaces for processing trauma while rebuilding social connections that colonialism had disrupted. Truth and reconciliation processes in some countries provided opportunities for public acknowledgement of historical wrongs and articulation of pathways toward healing relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, though implementation of recommendations from these processes often lagged behind rhetoric of reconciliation. The artistic expressions through which Indigenous peoples represented their experiences, histories, and visions for the future reached increasingly diverse audiences through galleries, museums, festivals, and online platforms. Contemporary Indigenous artists worked in all media, including painting, sculpture, film, literature, music, and performance art, creating works that engage with both traditional forms and contemporary artistic movements. Their art challenged stereotypes about Indigenous peoples as locked in the past or as victims without agency, presenting instead complex portrayals that acknowledged painful histories while asserting Indigenous peoples' continued presence and creative vitality. Major museums and galleries that had historically collected Indigenous cultural materials as ethnographic specimens increasingly featured contemporary Indigenous artists whose work was evaluated according to aesthetic criteria rather than simply as cultural documentation. The solidarity that emerged among Indigenous peoples globally reflected recognition of shared experiences with colonization and common struggles for rights and recognition. Pan-Indigenous networks facilitated exchange of strategies, provided mutual support during conflicts with states or corporations, and amplified voices that might otherwise go unheard. This solidarity coexisted with tremendous diversity among Indigenous peoples who spoke thousands of different languages, practiced varied cultural traditions, and lived in vastly different ecological and political contexts. The challenge lay in building movements that honored this diversity, while identifying common ground sufficient to coordinate effective advocacy and mutual support. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and nation-states that claimed authority over their territories remained fundamentally contested, despite legal and political changes that had occurred. States asserted sovereignty over all territory within their borders, while Indigenous peoples claimed inherent rights to self-determination and territorial control based on prior occupation and continued connection to ancestral lands. Negotiating relationships that respected both Indigenous rights and state interests required creative approaches that moved beyond zero-sum frameworks toward arrangements recognizing multiple, overlapping authorities and shared responsibilities for governing territories and peoples. The knowledge systems that Indigenous peoples maintained offered insights valuable for addressing global challenges, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and sustainable development. Traditional ecological knowledge accumulated through generations of careful observation and experimentation provided detailed understanding of local ecosystems and time-tested strategies for managing resources sustainably. Indigenous agricultural practices developed crops adapted to local conditions and maintained genetic diversity that industrial agriculture had sacrificed for short-term productivity. Indigenous governance systems demonstrated approaches to decision-making that prioritized long-term sustainability and collective well-being over individual profit. Recognizing the value of these knowledge systems required overcoming persistent assumptions that scientific knowledge represented the only legitimate form of understanding and that indigenous knowledge was merely folklore or superstition. The future that indigenous peoples would create depended partly on forces beyond their control, but also on choices that communities, leaders, and individuals made about priorities, strategies, and acceptable compromises. Maintaining cultural distinctiveness while engaging productively with broader societies required constant negotiation of boundaries and careful discernment about which changes represented adaptation necessary for survival and which threatened fundamental values or identities. Building economies that provided adequate livelihoods without destroying environments or undermining social relationships demanded creativity and willingness to experiment with novel approaches. Governing communities in ways that remained accountable to members while navigating complex relationships with external authorities required political sophistication and principled leadership. The resilience that had enabled indigenous peoples to survive centuries of colonization, dispossession, and attempted assimilation provided foundation for facing future challenges with determination and hope. This resilience emerged not from naive optimism, but from clear-eyed assessment of challenges, combined with commitment to maintaining identities and communities, regardless of obstacles. It drew strength from ancestors who had preserved languages, cultural practices, and connections to land through even darker periods. It manifested in young people who chose to learn traditional languages, in elders who continued teaching despite decades of discouragement, in activists who confronted powerful interests threatening indigenous rights, in artists who created beauty from pain, in leaders who guided communities through difficult transitions. The continuation of indigenous peoples as distinct cultural and political entities was never guaranteed, but remained possible because of choices that individuals and communities made to resist erasure and assert their continued presence in their homelands and in the world. The stories that indigenous peoples tell about themselves increasingly replace narratives that outsiders had constructed for them throughout the colonial period. For generations, anthropologists, missionaries, government officials, and other external observers had claimed authority to explain indigenous cultures, histories, and futures to the world. These outsiders produced volumes of scholarship, policy documents, and popular accounts that portrayed indigenous peoples as objects of study rather than subjects of their own stories. The shift toward indigenous authorship of their own narratives represents a fundamental challenge to colonial power relationships that had positioned non-indigenous experts as legitimate interpreters of indigenous realities. This reclamation of narrative authority extends beyond academic and political spheres into popular culture, where indigenous creators produce films, television shows, novels, and music that present indigenous perspectives without filtering them through non-indigenous intermediaries. Streaming platforms and social media enable indigenous storytellers to reach global audiences directly, bypassing traditional gatekeepers who had previously controlled access to mainstream distribution channels. The success of indigenous-created content demonstrates audience appetite for authentic indigenous voices and stories that challenge stereotypes perpetuated through decades of misrepresentation. The digital archives that indigenous communities create preserve knowledge in formats accessible to future generations who might not have direct access to elders or traditional territories. Video recordings capture elders speaking languages and sharing stories that might otherwise disappear when the last fluent speakers pass away. Photographs document ceremonies, landscapes, and daily life in ways that create visual records for descendants. Audio recordings preserve traditional songs, oral histories, and linguistic features that written transcription cannot fully capture. These archives serve both preservation and revitalization functions, providing resources that communities can use to maintain or restore cultural practices that colonial policies had disrupted. The legal frameworks that govern relationships between indigenous peoples and states continue evolving as courts interpret rights, governments negotiate agreements, and international bodies establish standards. Each legal victory establishes precedents that strengthen future claims, while each defeat reveals limitations in existing frameworks and need for new strategies. The accumulation of favorable decisions, even when imperfectly implemented, shifts baseline expectations about what Indigenous peoples can legitimately demand and what obligations states must fulfill. This gradual legal evolution never proceeds quickly enough for communities facing immediate threats, but creates foundations that future generations can build upon. The economic strategies that Indigenous communities pursue increasingly emphasize sovereignty and self-determination, rather than merely seeking integration into mainstream economies on terms dictated by others. Indigenous businesses that draw on cultural knowledge to produce distinctive products create economic value while maintaining cultural connections. Development corporations that Indigenous communities control enable them to pursue projects aligned with community values rather than accepting whatever development outsiders propose. Financial institutions designed to serve Indigenous communities provide capital for enterprises that conventional lenders might ignore or undervalue. These economic initiatives demonstrate that prosperity and cultural preservation need not conflict when Indigenous peoples control development processes and define success according to their own priorities. The environmental crises that threaten all humanity create contexts where Indigenous knowledge and leadership become increasingly valuable for survival. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse demand solutions that industrial societies have proven unable or unwilling to implement. Indigenous peoples whose cultures developed through thousands of years of sustainable relationships with particular environments possess knowledge about maintaining ecological balance that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. The protection of Indigenous territories represents one of the most effective strategies for preserving biodiversity and sequestering carbon, making Indigenous land rights not merely matters of justice, but crucial components of global environmental protection. The younger generations who inherit both the traumas and the strengths of their ancestors face choices about how to move forward while honouring the past. They must navigate between maintaining cultural traditions and adapting to changed circumstances, between confronting injustices and building productive relationships, between asserting distinctiveness and participating in broader societies. These are not new dilemmas. Indigenous peoples have always negotiated between continuity and change, but the pace of transformation and the stakes involved create unprecedented urgency. The decisions that young Indigenous people make about language use, cultural practice, political engagement, and economic participation will shape whether Indigenous peoples in another century remain distinct cultural and political entities, or become absorbed into dominant societies that have sought their assimilation for generations. The alliances that Indigenous peoples build with non-Indigenous supporters create possibilities for broader coalitions that can challenge entrenched power structures and advocate for systemic changes. Environmental organizations, human rights groups, progressive religious communities, and social justice movements increasingly recognize that Indigenous rights struggles connect to their own concerns about environmental protection, democratic participation, and equitable distribution of power and resources. These alliances prove most effective when built on genuine respect for Indigenous leadership and priorities, rather than non-Indigenous agendas that merely incorporate Indigenous issues as subsidiary concerns. The technologies that transform how humans communicate, organize, and understand the world present both opportunities and dangers for Indigenous peoples. Digital tools enable cultural preservation and political organizing, while also exposing communities to surveillance, cultural appropriation, and the homogenizing forces of global media culture. Artificial intelligence systems trained on dominant cultural materials may perpetuate biases or fail to serve Indigenous needs appropriately. Biotechnology that analyzes Indigenous genetic materials raises concerns about exploitation and violations of cultural protocols. Navigating these technological developments requires vigilance about protecting Indigenous rights, while also ensuring that Indigenous peoples benefit from innovations rather than being excluded or harmed. The education systems that shape how future generations understand history, culture, and identity increasingly incorporate Indigenous perspectives that challenge colonial narratives. Curricula that once portrayed Indigenous peoples as obstacles to progress or as vanishing remnants of the past now include content that acknowledges colonial violence, recognizes ongoing Indigenous presence, and presents Indigenous cultures as dynamic rather than static. These changes result from decades of advocacy by Indigenous educators and communities who insisted that schools serving Indigenous students must reflect Indigenous knowledge and values. The transformation remains incomplete and uneven across jurisdictions, but the direction of change suggests growing recognition that education must serve Indigenous students and communities rather than functioning primarily as a assimilation tool. The health disparities that affect Indigenous peoples reflect centuries of colonial violence, dispossession, and marginalization, rather than any inherent Indigenous susceptibility to disease or dysfunction. Addressing these disparities requires confronting root causes including poverty, inadequate housing, food insecurity, and ongoing trauma rather than merely treating symptoms. Health systems that incorporate Indigenous healing practices alongside biomedical approaches demonstrate possibilities for care that respects cultural differences while providing effective treatment. Community-controlled health services enable Indigenous peoples to design programs that address priorities they identify rather than accepting externally imposed definitions of health needs. The spiritual traditions that sustained Indigenous peoples through generations of oppression continue providing meaning and guidance in contemporary contexts. These traditions adapt to changed circumstances while maintaining essential connections to ancestors, territories, and cosmologies that define Indigenous worldviews. The suppression of Indigenous spiritual practices that characterized earlier colonial periods has given way to greater, though still imperfect, recognition of religious freedom rights. Communities work to revitalize ceremonial practices, protect sacred sites, and transmit spiritual knowledge to younger generations who may have been raised without exposure to traditional beliefs and practices. The artistic expressions through which Indigenous peoples communicate their experiences, visions, and critiques reach audiences that might never engage with academic scholarship or political advocacy. Literature by Indigenous authors provides intimate portraits of Indigenous life that challenge stereotypes and build empathy across cultural divides. Films that Indigenous directors create offer visual narratives that counter dominant media representations. Music that Indigenous artists produce demonstrates creative vitality, while sometimes explicitly addressing political themes. Visual art that incorporates traditional forms and contemporary techniques asserts Indigenous presence in the art world, while maintaining cultural distinctiveness. These artistic productions serve multiple functions simultaneously, operating as cultural expression, political statement, economic activity, and bridge building across differences. The solidarity networks that connect Indigenous peoples globally demonstrate recognition that local struggles reflect patterns repeated across continents, and that collective action increases possibilities for achieving rights that individual communities cannot secure alone. International organizations provide platforms for sharing strategies, coordinating advocacy, and presenting unified positions on issues affecting Indigenous peoples worldwide. Regional networks enable Indigenous peoples in particular areas to collaborate on shared concerns while respecting differences in specific circumstances. These networks prove particularly valuable when opposing powerful corporations or challenging government policies, as coordinated responses increase pressure and reduce ability of authorities to dismiss concerns as isolated complaints. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and the lands they inhabit remains central to identity, culture, and survival, despite centuries of dispossession and displacement. For Indigenous peoples, territories represent far more than economic resources or real estate. They embody histories, contain sacred sites, sustain traditional practices, and define relationships that extend across generations. This fundamental connection to place means that threats to land represent threats to identity itself. Conversely, maintaining access to and control over traditional territories enables continuation of cultural practices, transmission of knowledge, and fulfillment of responsibilities to ancestors and future generations. The political autonomy that Indigenous peoples seek requires more than symbolic recognition or consultative roles in decision-making processes controlled by others. Meaningful self-determination demands authority to make and implement decisions affecting Indigenous peoples, territories, and resources according to Indigenous values and priorities. This doesn't necessarily require complete independence from existing states, but does require relationships based on consent rather than coercion, on recognition of Indigenous authority rather than subordination to external control. The specific forms that self-determination takes vary across contexts, but the principle remains constant. Indigenous peoples possess inherent rights to govern themselves that pre-exist and supersede claims that states make to authority over Indigenous territories and populations. The challenges that Indigenous peoples face in pursuing self-determination reflect the unwillingness of states and corporations to cede control over territories and resources they have claimed despite Indigenous objections. Governments fear that recognizing Indigenous sovereignty might create precedents that undermine state authority or complicate resource development. Corporations resist Indigenous control over territories containing valuable minerals, forests, or fossil fuels. These conflicts pit Indigenous rights against powerful economic and political interests that have dominated relationships between Indigenous peoples and states throughout the colonial period. Overcoming this resistance requires sustained pressure through legal challenges, political advocacy, direct action, and our national attention that makes continued denial of Indigenous rights increasingly costly for those who benefit from existing arrangements. The hope that sustains Indigenous peoples through ongoing struggles comes not from naive optimism about inevitable progress, but from clear-eyed recognition of what has been survived and what remains possible. Indigenous peoples have endured colonization, disease, forced relocation, cultural suppression, and systematic attempts to eliminate them as distinct peoples. They have maintained languages that authorities tried to eradicate, preserved knowledge that schools refused to teach, sustained connections to lands that others claimed, and passed cultural traditions to new generations despite obstacles designed to sever those transmissions. This history of resilience provides evidence that Indigenous peoples can continue surviving and indeed thriving regardless of challenges that await. The ancestors who maintained Indigenous cultures through the darkest periods of colonial oppression did so without knowing whether their efforts would prove sufficient, whether their grandchildren would speak the languages they fought to preserve, whether the lands they defended would remain in Indigenous hands. They persisted because they understood that cultural survival required ongoing commitment, regardless of outcomes that remained uncertain. Contemporary Indigenous peoples inherit both this legacy of determined resistance and the responsibility to continue struggles that previous generations could not complete. They carry forward work that has no definite endpoint, but rather represents ongoing processes of maintaining identity, asserting rights, protecting territories, and building futures that honor the past while adapting to changing circumstances. The non-Indigenous people who genuinely support Indigenous rights face their own responsibilities for challenging the systems that continue benefiting them at Indigenous people's expense. Solidarity requires more than sympathy or passive support. It demands active work to dismantle structures that maintain Indigenous subordination, to return control over resources and territories that were stolen, to amplify Indigenous voices rather than speaking for them, to follow Indigenous leadership rather than imposing external agendas. Non-Indigenous allies must grapple with their own complicity in systems that dispossessed Indigenous peoples and continue benefiting from that dispossession, even if they personally oppose the injustices involved. The futures that remain possible for Indigenous peoples depend partly on decisions that others make, but ultimately rest on choices that Indigenous peoples themselves make about priorities, strategies, and acceptable compromises. No external authority can grant self-determination. It must be asserted and defended through ongoing resistance to subordination. No government decree can revitalize a language. It requires communities deciding that transmission to younger generations matters enough to justify the enormous effort involved. No court decision can heal historical trauma. It requires individuals and communities choosing to undertake difficult processes of acknowledgement, grieving, and rebuilding. The agency that Indigenous peoples exercise in confronting these challenges determines whether they will continue as distinct peoples or whether the colonial project of elimination will ultimately succeed through slower processes of assimilation and cultural loss. The stories that future generations tell about this period will judge whether those living now did enough to protect what remains, to restore what can be recovered, to imagine and create possibilities that ancestors could not have envisioned. These judgments will be rendered not by historians writing from comfortable distance, but by descendants who will inherit either vibrant Indigenous cultures and autonomous communities, or the remnants of what was lost through insufficient commitment during crucial moments. The weight of this responsibility falls most heavily on those who understand what is at stake and possess capacity to affect outcomes through their choices and actions. The land remembers everything even when human memories fail or deliberately suppress uncomfortable truths. The territories that Indigenous peoples have inhabited for thousands of years contain evidence of continuous presence that no amount of historical revisionism can completely erase. Archaeological sites, place names in Indigenous languages, oral traditions that describe landscapes in intimate detail, all testify to relationships between Indigenous peoples and territories that long predate colonial invasion. This embedded history provides foundation for claims that states have tried to deny but cannot ultimately refute. The land itself stands as witness to truths that colonizers would prefer to forget. The waters that sustained Indigenous peoples for millennia continue flowing even as pollution, damming, and climate change alter their character. The fish that swim in these waters, the marine mammals that inhabit coastal areas, the waterfowl that migrate along ancient flyways, all maintain connections to ecosystems that Indigenous peoples have been part of since time immemorial. These ecological relationships persist despite disruptions and provide ongoing opportunities for practicing traditional harvesting and maintaining cultural connections to environments that shaped Indigenous societies. Protecting these relationships from further degradation becomes crucial, not only for cultural reasons, but for ecological integrity that benefits all peoples. The sky above Indigenous territories displays the same stars that guided ancestors across generations, the same moon that measured time before colonial calendars imposed different temporal frameworks, the same sun that marked seasons before written records documented their passage. This cosmic continuity connects contemporary Indigenous peoples to ancestors in ways that transcend the disruptions that colonization created in earthly affairs. Traditional knowledge about celestial patterns, their relationships to earthly events, and their significance for navigation, ceremonial timing, and understanding of cosmic order continues being transmitted even as light pollution from expanding settlements obscures night skies, and modern technology provides alternative methods for timekeeping and wayfinding. The stories wait to be told by those who will come after, who will look back at this moment and ask what was done, what was preserved, what was lost, What might have been saved if different choices had been made? These future peoples will inherit the consequences of decisions made now about language preservation, land protection, cultural transmission, and political organizing. They will judge whether this generation honored responsibilities to ancestors who preserved culture through more difficult circumstances, and to descendants who deserve to inherit living indigenous cultures rather than museums of extinct traditions. The stories they tell will be shaped by what happens in the years and decades immediately ahead as Indigenous peoples navigate between unprecedented threats and previously unimaginable opportunities for asserting rights and rebuilding communities.